Okay, so firstly, before we get into the event, just to answer a simple question, why are MPAC UK doing an event that's titled Together with French Muslims? Well, firstly, a sign of Iman for any Muslim is that we are concerned for the plight of our Ummah. And secondly, for any of us in the UK, France is geographically our neighbor. So we have an extra responsibility in terms of supporting the Muslims of France. And thirdly, if you want to ignore these selfless reasons and focus on the selfish reason, then basically, if we ignore what is done to Muslims in France over there, then inevitably that Islamophobia, that institutionalized Islamophobia, will spread here to the UK. Now, today's event is the second in a two-part series. The first part is already up on our Facebook page and will be up with French subtitles, inshallah, across our other social media platforms. So follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, or TikTok to get updated. Part one was about understanding why the situation for the French Muslims is what it is. And today is going to be about understanding what UK Muslims could possibly do next to help our French counterparts. We have some simple ground rules. The chat function is for questions, which will be answered in the Q&A at the end. The chat is not for provoking or for responding to provocation, and anyone who breaks this simple rule will be removed. Questions from our Zoom audience will be prioritized. And if there's time, we will come to questions from our Facebook audience. To join in on Zoom at our next event, book a ticket on Eventbrite and look out for updates on our social media. So with no further ado, our first speaker today was the last speaker at the previous event. She is a teenage daughter of one of our volunteers. And we need to remember, it is the youth who so often pay the price of the adults' political decisions. So her words are a testimonial of what the next generation are currently going through and a reminder of what the Muslim community in France and the UK might lose if we stand by and do nothing at all. She is shy, so she sent me a recording. She asked me to play the recording instead. So please do listen closely. I'm just going to set it up now.
My name is Amina. I am 14 years old. I am French and arrived from France last year in October. My life was different then, but I only realized how much different it was when I started school after lockdown this year. Going into an English school felt like entering another world to me. First shock to me was when I saw a girl wearing a headscarf walking to school. She seemed happy, laughing with her friends. I stopped. I stared at her for a few seconds. It felt so strange. I remembered my friend Shema, back in France, who would have to remove her hijab before entering school to put it on back after. Shema could laugh outside of school, but in school was never comfortable, spending her breaks and lunch times in the girls' toilets, trying her best not to be seen, sitting at the back of the classroom, never participating. Shema has chosen to wear the hijab. No one forced her. In France, we do not wear school uniforms. We abide by the freedom to wear what we want. However, this freedom has limits. Girls are not allowed to wear headscarf in France. We are not allowed to express our religion or who we are. We can only express our fashion taste and social background somehow. In France, you can see how rich you are or how poor, but you mustn't show your religion even if you have one. In England, although everybody wears the uniform at school, we can see everybody's differences. Everybody is comfortable with their religion, culture, and ethnicity. These differences are even talked about during assemblies, which we do not have in France. Assemblies is where we are taught how to respect each other, how to live together despite our differences. Every time they speak about embracing differences and respecting other religions, I still feel like it's an illegal speech. I still struggle in hearing this type of talk, although I know it is only just. During lunchtime, I couldn't believe it. There was a halal option to choose from, and another strange feeling I had. How considerate of the school. I couldn't believe they would offer an option for Muslims. Never in France halal food will enter the canteen. As a Muslim, you would become vegetarian, even if you're not. As a Muslim, in my new school, I felt so welcomed and valued. I was part of the school. I didn't have to pretend to be someone else. They were just fine with who I am. I understood how in France being a Muslim wasn't easy. To be honest, I would ask my mom not to collect me from school because I was a bit embarrassed of her as she was wearing the hijab. I was told that Muslim women with hijab were manipulated, ignorant, and submissive from a background civilization. I didn't want my friends to know my mother was a practicing Muslim. Coming in the UK made me realize how independent and free my mother is. Even the way I see my own mother has changed, though I always knew her. While living in France, I was ashamed of who I am and where I came from. In England, not only I have found the freedom, but also got a boost in self-esteem. I feel so confident now. I am no more less than others. I am equal to others with equal rights. If I want to wear the hijab, I am free to do so. If I also don't want to wear the hijab, I am free to do so. But I only know it will be my choice and no one else. I am only 14, but I can tell today what I was made to feel in France is wrong. I wish upon no child in this world this feeling of not being acknowledged as who you are and forced to be someone else. To be made to feel so little and ashamed because of who you are, where you came from, should be a crime made legal. No one should have the right to do this to a child. No state has the right to do so. This is wrong, and any adult not able to see it has forgotten what it is to be like a child.
So just to summarize what she was saying, basically, what you're seeing there is a young person who is a Muslim, wants to be treated as a Muslim, and because she feels accepted after she moved to the UK, she's just happier to be a part of the society here. And that is what we have to lose if we don't do something to help the French Muslim, to help the Muslims in France. It's also a reminder of what we have in the UK and what we must also try not to lose here in the UK as well. We're going to move on now to our first live speaker. His name is Yasser Louati. He is a French human rights and civil liberties advocate, a community organizer, and political analyst. He has been active since the mid-1990s and been a leading voice against racism and state authoritarianism in Europe and around the world. After years of grassroots activism and international campaigns out of Paris, Yasser founded the CJL, the Justice and Liberties for All Committee, which is a transnational human rights and civil liberties organization. Yasser is fluent in French, English, and Arabic, and is a regular contributor to international news outlets such as the BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, TRT, and among others. We're really happy to have him with us today. He'll be explaining to us his assessment of the situation, including the flaws in how Muslims have organized traditionally in France. He would also explain how the French political system works and what Muslims in the UK can do next to help. Brother Yasser, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for organizing this event, and thanks twice for inviting me to speak on it. The situation, as you know, summarized by this young lady, says a lot about France's political elites, willingness to put Muslims back in their place. And this is not something new. This is part of a long colonial history. And what is being applied to Muslims today was applied in the colonies, of course, through various means. The goal is, of course, for the French government to make it impossible for Muslims to not only exist in the public space, as we saw it with the banning of the headscarf in public schools, but also by cracking down on organizations. On Wednesday, I'm pretty sure people spoke of the current situation post anti-separatism law, but what we have to address is what made these laws possible. I will just take maybe a minute or two to also give my own assessment of the situation and why things gotten so bad. Muslims have been making headlines internationally out of France because of terrorism, because of identity politics, but also because of the failures of political elites from addressing the real problems of France in terms of mass unemployment, corruption, institutional meltdown, the failures of the EU, etc., etc. Many people, when they come to France, they tend to get shocked by what Muslims are experiencing in terms of normalized Islamophobia in the media, but furthermore, by the number of laws that were passed against them. People oftentimes relate to the banning of the headscarf back in 2004, but we also have to take a deeper look in for how many decades France has been trying to crack down on Muslims, of course, through various means and different approaches. Back in the 60s and 50s, it was the decolonial struggle, and people were marching for freedom in Muslim majority countries, and France cracked down brutally on them. For example, the October 17th massacre in Paris, in which hundreds of Algerians were killed by the police, so much so that their bodies were thrown into the Seine River. In the 1970s, there was a massive repression against against unions who were organizing Muslim workers in car factories and coal mines, etc. And the government cracked down on them. And in order for the government to not face a contradiction, they had to label these strikes and demonstrations as holy strikes, that somehow these workers were not organizing for better wages, equality of treatment, the same level of promotions for African workers. No, they were being organized by the invisible hand of the Iranian mullahs. So they call them Shia organizers, even though the overwhelming majority of Muslims in France come from Sunni majority countries, which means there were almost no Shias in France, let alone Shias who were able to have sufficient influence to organize Muslim workers. So of course you have to disqualify and you have to put these people not in the box of citizens organizing for their rights, but Muslim radicals organizing for domination and special treatment. The 1980s, as we saw the emergence of what we call the second generation, people who were born in France and beginning to organize, they had now to turn into identity politics. And we saw that as Muslims organized for freedom, equal rights, against police brutality, for access to decent jobs, decent housing, political representation, and against systemic racism, they couldn't say, well, we are against these people because they call for equality. We are against these people because now they represent a threat to the status quo. And as early as the years 1983, 1987, we saw, for example, books speaking of so-called immigration as a shock to the country, and that these people could not be assimilated. So their parents were brutally repressed, and were the children organized just to be fully fledged citizens, equal in rights and obligations toward the rest of the nation? No, they were called unfit to be integrated into the body of the nation. And in 1987, we also have, for example, the first commission that wanted to review the citizenship code in order to make it impossible or almost impossible for people who are born in France to have automatic access to citizenship. In France, we have a long history of, if you are born on French soil, you are automatically French. During the Vichy era, in order to exclude the Jews from the nation, they reviewed that and said, you are only French through blood. If your parents are not French, you cannot be a French citizen. And that was, of course, abandoned. And we came back to the long French tradition of, if you are born in France, you are French citizen. But the problem is, those people who are being born in France were non-white. They were oftentimes Muslims, and now they dare to organize to be equal citizens. In 1987, we have the Marceau Commission that tried to put an end to it. It did not work, but the debate was launched. And my point now is that it's not only about a specific project failing, it's about the repercussions of that project, because you make it normal to question the citizenship of people based on their skin color, if not their religion. The 1980s of course, we saw the gradual acceleration of anti-Muslim rhetoric. 1989, the first banning of the headscarf in public schools. 1994, even though the highest administration in France banned schools from discriminating between kids, saying the schools of the Republic are not meant to differentiate between kids. We welcome all kids, whether they wear a headscarf or not. The problem is that decision, the landmark decision of 1989, was ignored, and in 1994 and then 2004, laws were passed to actually go against laicity, which is about the neutrality of the state, and turn laicity about neutrality of users of state services. I'm going to spare you the details and come back to what happened a few months ago. And two major bills were passed under Emmanuel Macron. The Anti-Separatism Bill, in the wake of the beheading of Samuel Paty, and the Comprehensive Security Bill. These two bills the first one was about cracking down on the capacity of Muslims to organize. The second one was to crack down on the whole of civil society by making it impossible, for example, to record the police officers when they are beating people in order to expose them in the media and then prosecute them. The reaction of the government was not, we are going to discipline the police in order to make sure they don't behave like thugs. We are going to make it impossible for citizens to use their phones and to record the police. The other one came, of course, at a very, how can I say, it was the perfect storm or the perfect moment for the government, because as we saw organizations in France calling out Islamophobia, rallying against discrimination, etc., the goal of the government was to make it impossible for Muslims to organize as Muslims. And this is when the shutting down of CCIE happened and that of BarakaCity. These laws were, they go against every single piece of legislation we can have in France in terms of human rights and civil liberties. They go against freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, freedom to organize, freedom to challenge the government, and even the Declaration of Human Rights of 1789 speaks of the right to organize, to face the injustices of the government. Now, the bill, of course, made headlines back in October following Emmanuel Macron's speech. People up, across the globe are like, what's happening, between France and its French citizens. Now, I want to address something that people don't necessarily want to speak about. Of course, we can call out the government every day. We can call out the French Republic for its failures, towards non-white citizens. We can call out all these repressive laws. But when something happens, there must be reasons that allow it to happen. What would make the French government, in the midst of a pandemic, an economic crisis, outright defiance towards the political representatives, to come up with such a law? Was it the immediate urgency? No, it was not. There were a lot more urgent problems to solve. Again, the pandemic being one of them. Back then, dozens of thousands of people had already died from the pandemic. The government failed the French people. But what Emmanuel Macron came up with was, let's crack down on these Muslims and shut down these organizations. Now, the anti-separatism bill, now the anti-separatism law, has exposed not only the failures of the political elite, but also the failures of Muslim organizations, specifically, and more broadly, French civil society. How come there was no real resistance against this bill? First, we have the Grand Mosque of Paris and its rector, Shamsuddin Hafiz, who came up with the Charter of Imams. The Charter of Imams was a letter to be signed by all imams in France, promising not to address state racism, not to address foreign conflicts, not to address French intervention abroad, not to criticize France in whatever it does. And this goes against the basic human rights of any human being around the world, let alone in France. And If Emmanuel Macron came up with the idea of a charter, the rector of the Grand Mosque of Paris came up with the most brutal and most radical version of it. And people, nevertheless, went along and signed it. We called, even though I am not a religious, leader, and I don't, get involved in what happens in religious communities, we called on people to pressure their local representatives to refuse this charter of imams. Nevertheless, a majority of mosques signed behind the back of their congregations, which raises the question of how do mosques function, and do Muslim leaders really answer the people they pretend to speak of? The other problem, as the anti-separatism bill was being, prepared, and other was all the political marketing being, pushed forward through, mainstream and even far-right outlets, two collectives were set up against it. Now you would ask, why two? Why not one? And these two collectives were fighting one another and acting in parallel from one another instead of working together, which means that they failed to build momentum and get together to work against it. And do people speak about that? Not necessarily. The other problem, and I'm going to address the what might make people angry, is that the anti-separatism bill and now the anti-separatism law has also exposed the failed model of Muslim organizations, be it CCIE or others, because if you have been in existence for over 15 years, and when you faced direct pressure from the government, you self-dissolve and flee the country in 2 weeks, what does it say about your grassroots organizing, the training you should have provided to people to organize, the capacity to build coalitions and alliances, so you are not alone in this struggle? And my, from 26 years of activism, and I was in grade school, thank God, I had people to mentor me from a very early age, is that people begin, enter the struggle and they want things to start and end with them, which means their capacities and their limitations are those of everybody else. And people don't work together, they work as rivals to one another, if not against each other. The message sent by the government is that we can not only shut down your organizations, but we can also prosecute the people who bring these issues in the public sphere. We have to remember that for 2 weeks, they had been raiding Muslim homes, mosques, and charities the same way they did between 2015 and 2017 with the state of emergency. And the reasons to raid the people were unclear. The prefects, who are the local heads of the police, were randomly targeting people. We had people sleeping by the entrance door, one of them being myself, because we were expecting the cops to slam the door and come in in our homes at 4 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the morning. And this sent, to us, it was a reminder that the lessons of the state of emergency were not learned, and nothing was done to prevent such repression from the government. Now, we continue and move forward with what can be done, and I have 5 minutes left. France, like any other country, has its own political problems. As we can see, capitalism is failing. We have problems with our institutions. The European Union project, or the European experiment, is also showing its limits. We can thank, Angela Merkel and Germany for that, but that's another debate. What we also have to address is that political representation cannot be gained by pandering to the existing political parties. The political parties in France, from the far left to the far right, can disagree on everything, but when it comes to their relationship with Muslims, they tend to agree, if not work together. If we speak of the mainstream parties, the Socialist Party or the Communist Party, even though it is, almost going extinct, they have sometimes the same rhetoric as the far right when it comes to Muslims. Anytime a Muslim person steps forward and has a public discourse that is critical of the government, of existing laws, he or she becomes an Islamist. And opening this Pandora box allows any blind repression against them. They are no longer invited in mainstream media. They are cast aside by existing political parties, because the narrative they try to push questions not only Islamophobia, but also white privilege, that they are the people who can frame the problem, but also bring in the solutions. So the solution to me is for Muslims to be capable to organize on their own. And this independence has to come from thought to action. You cannot outsource the analysis of your problem to a person who does not experience it on a day-to-day basis. You cannot outsource the organizing to a political party, because they do not care and they will only use it when it is politically profitable. You cannot count on the left to act first and then you join. If it is your problem, you take the matter into your own hands, and for God's sake, you stop thinking about yourself and you make things about everybody. Not one individual wins the struggle. Not one organization wins the struggle. Coalitions do, movements do, and these coalitions and these movements can gain momentum when people make it about something bigger than themselves. No, your career, your reputation, the number of followers and likes you're gonna get online, they will not make a difference. What will make a difference is your capacity to combine whatever you bring to the table with what other people are bringing. I've got 2 minutes now, and these 2 minutes will be left to the UK audience. France spends its time lecturing the rest of the world on human rights, civil liberties, the rights of minorities, etc. It lectures Muslim countries, not Muslim countries, Asian, African, whatever. France, again, and I say it for the umpteenth time, is in no position to lecture any other country on human rights. This means that if you are in the UK, you first have to remember that France is the laboratory of Islamophobia. Second, you have to keep in mind that your government does work with the French government in order to put in place systems of repression that are working together. If you have a prevent in the UK, we have Stop Jihadism and the permanent state of emergency in France. If you have a far-right pundits in the mainstream media, we have Eric Zemmour here and the normalization of the anti-Muslim rhetoric, which means that you always have to be able to reach out to organizers in France and give them an echo chamber through your networks. The one thing the few ideas that I have forward is to call out France, for example, in the UK through demonstrations in front of the French embassy, to call out French representatives when they come to your institutions and start lecturing you about the grandiose history of France when it comes to human rights. Of course, to seek information on France's brutality against black, brown people in Africa and Asia, and what is happening today in France. The failures that we all share in France, in continental Europe, in the UK, North America, is that as repression is becoming a global apparatus, civil society keeps acting in separate silos. It is okay to be specialized in a specific problem, but please remember, your problem is not isolated from that of another. And if you are Muslim, Islamophobia is not the only problem you're facing, because Islamophobia is the most recent, or if not the most popular expression of repression across the board. And I ask, British, American, French Muslims, let's say your government calls out Islamophobia and says, that's evil, we need to stop. Are you going to be quiet when the Roma people are targeted? Are you going to be quiet when they start targeting, I don't know, like South Asian or African people or people from the Caribbean? You're going to be fine with it? I hope not. which means that your efforts against Islamophobia not only have to be sincere enough to break through the glass ceiling of this celebrity activism and always having to seek a white savior or a white, I have a word that starts with P, but I'm going to be polite and not use it here. And I will have to apologize to Ahmed. But you also have to make sure that once this effort is put in place, specifically against Islamophobia, that you have opened enough gates and windows that you can work with people who are dealing with anti-Semitism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Black racism, and most importantly, that you do not frame Islamophobia as a religious problem. It is not. It's a problem of religious liberties, because if you frame it as it's about Muslims against the rest, you are definitely helping the Islamophobes, because they will tell you, well, if to you it's the Muslim problem, well, this is a secular country, so your problem is not my problem. The other thing, and I'm going to stop with it, I've already busted my time. One thing that comes quite, in my, weekly talks and in my podcast is that people come to you and say, well, it's my right because my religion teaches this and that. I'm going to be polite. Who cares about what your religion teaches? There are universal freedoms that allow you to practice your religion if you are Muslim, if you have no religion, if you are Christian, if you are Jewish. The problem is that these freedoms have been restrained, that only you as a Muslim cannot practice your religion. And that's why your problem is a human rights and civil liberties problem. You cannot convince the legislator by quoting, I don't know, the Quran or even other, classic books of, Islamic law. Why? Again, because the narrative here, it's a secular country. And in that case, this secularism allows everybody to live together, but also not to create preferences between that group and another. Thank you for listening. I know I've went through my 20-minute allocated time, but I thank the organizers, and I will be available for your questions if you have some. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Yasser, for that very comprehensive analysis and explanation of how we got into this situation, how the Muslims of France are in that situation, and what you're doing is you've started the conversation in terms of how we may support them seeing it through. Because of the work that we do in MPACUK and the work that the way we try to mobilize the Muslim community, not just at election time, but in terms of the entire political process, which is more than voting. That is our realm of experience. That is our expertise. So the first question I'm going to take from the chat is going to be based on that, because that is something that inshallah we can learn from and help utilize. So the question here is, what political system is there in France? For example, in the UK, our political system, we call it the first by the post election system, which is it's just a case of which candidate has the most votes, and they are the one who wins. They win that seat, and then the number of seats in parliament are added up, and the party that has the overall majority forms a clear government. If they are just under that, they can form a coalition and create a joint coalition government or a minority government, etc., etc. In France, I assume it's a completely different system. Please, could you explain to us what the political system is there, and therefore what are the points of leverage, the levers of power that the Muslim community in France can have? And then as a part B to that point, how can we help them? Would you be able to shed some light on that, please?
Sure. So thanks. I think it's Nadia Yacoub who asked a question. So thank her. Thank her for the question. It's not really that different. It's always, we have local elections where you elect your mayor, where you elect the head of the department, which is like, a county. And of course, then you can elect your representative in the National Assembly and then the Senate. So the representation works basically almost as in the UK. What Muslims and all minorities and people who bring a radical critical approach to what's happening in France is that access to political representation is a rigged system, because you don't necessarily have the means. You have the means to run, but the problem is a campaign costs a lot of money. So we do have public funding for candidates, but you have to reach a specific percentage to get your funding reimbursed by the state, which is excellent when compared, for example, to what's happening in the US, where you literally have to bring in millions to the table if you want to run for election, which makes you basically a puppet for the financial lobbies that may push this or that agenda. So in France, it is easier, but still complicated. So you have to either run as an independent or affiliate yourself with a political party. The problem is that once you run for election, you don't have granted access to the media, unless, for example, you're running for the presidential election. But if you run for the presidential election, you have to secure 500 signatures from elected officials. So you have to be co-opted. You can't come as an independent. Let's say tomorrow, people want to run for election. You still have to secure these signatures. So the people who will sign for you are either people who wholeheartedly agree with you or have an interest to push you forward in order to sabotage the campaign of the other party. For example, with the left, we push ludicrous candidates to kind of sabotage the chances of the left to win. However, gains can be made, especially at the local level, because it requires a lot less resources. And if you have been able to organize locally, you can get sufficient means to gain leverage and then win a local election. Now, the challenges you face at the local level is that all the centers of powers are always affiliated with a bigger center of power. For example, grassroots organizations will tend to be affiliated with the mayor in place, and the mayor in place will buy their loyalty through public donations. So, for example, I can quote a southern town in Paris. I'm from the south side of Paris, and when an independent candidate went to run for election, he came out of nowhere. He was already making 5% in a local election. No publicity, nothing. Just putting his name out, it was already 5% because he was quite influential in his hood, and they supported him. What happened? The mayor called the mosque, asking them to pressure him to withdraw, which they did. They called him and pressured him to withdraw. And the stick used by the mosque is, of course, he's sowing divisions, he's, making a disservice to the Muslim community, etc. So he had to withdraw. Another example would be you run for election, and the organizations you could count on are already affiliated with other political parties. Of course, not officially, but they know that they get, again, funding or access to infrastructure through that political parties, which means you may have a legitimacy as an individual, but all these centers of powers you could seek support from are already working with bigger centers of powers. And that's why criticism towards the status quo also goes through how things are working at the grassroots level. I'm going to give you an example, and this is my personal experience back in the years 2010. I was organizing in the south of Paris, in a town called Attilai. You can Google it. I had come back from, I was working abroad for many years. I came back to France and I had no intention of getting involved. Nevertheless, you don't change who you are, and again, you do it again, nevertheless. And we managed to successfully make a campaign that makes the mayor in place lose after 20 years in power. Something unseen. It's not like a major, it's not a college town. It's a small town in the outskirts of Paris that nobody has even heard of. Nevertheless, by properly organizing voters, by properly exposing candidates, and the goal was, we launched a campaign called Je vote, donc je pèse. In English, it would be, I vote, therefore I exist, basically. And we didn't call to vote for any candidate. We just exposed the programs and exposed what they call the current mayor was doing. The mayor loses, a new mayor is elected, and then I was out of it, but the local Muslim community organizes to try to unite the two rival Muslim organizations in order to build a bigger mosque, and then for this mosque to be independent from any influence, the Moroccan embassy or the Algerian or Turkish, whatever, that the mosque works for the community. What happened is that the Moroccan consulate or the Moroccan embassy, through its agents, brought the two Muslim organizations against the Muslim youth that were organizing for a unified mosque, if I can say. Even though I was out of it, hell broke loose on me, and the local imam went on top of the minbar and said, what Yasser Louati is doing is dividing Muslims. So we make a campaign that brings citizens to the voting booth. Voters decide to vote for another mayor. Muslims organize, and the only thing that the local mosque does is not praise Muslims for their capacity to organize and to mobilize, but to call out the person who managed to bring them together. And in the end, it was impossible to unite these Muslims. And the local mosques are, again, the two organizations over there are now fighting each other again. And the common project was abandoned. So what we need, and this also I think applies to many parts of Europe, is a revolution in how people think about themselves as minorities in the West. That you cannot depend on your home country. The Moroccan government never supported Moroccan citizens when they face discrimination, police brutality, when they face racism, etc. Same thing for the Algerian embassy, same thing for the Turkish embassy, etc. Muslims, wherever they are, have to organize the same way other communities have organized. Whether they are religious communities, political communities, whatever, you cannot sacrifice your independence for the comfort of being part or being, how can I say, the puppet of a bigger organization.
Jazakallah khairan for that, brother Yasser. And just in your telling of that, it just there's so much resonance, I feel, with our own experience as MPACUK. Like, anyone who's been following our organization for the 20 years that we've been running would know that mosques have been one of the obstacles, not mosques as an institution, the kind of mosque leader that has such investment in the status quo. It might be that the local politicians gives them planning permission to build a bigger mosque, or visits the mosque physically and gives them that prestige, and these shallow trade-offs between honor and personal prestige. These are the kinds of mosques that have been such an obstacle to the work that we've been doing as well. And I suppose it shouldn't be surprising, but hearing it happen in a completely different country, that same mentality happening as well. The silver lining is obviously that because our UK Muslim audience would be familiar with that kind of mosque leader, it means that we can also understand where one of the base problems that, as you have explained it, one of the base root problems is that mosques are not being accountable to their communities. They are
definitely not. I agree with you, yes.
And they are not fostering unity. In fact, they may be, in some cases, fostering the opposite for the sake of, perhaps shallow privileges. The next question is, I think, linked to this. This is the question. Shall one organization be created to unite all organizations? Can, for example, we do it in the UK to represent them, such as BDS, using, for example, the solution you proposed? I'll just give it a bit of a stab answering this, and then I'm going to pass it on to Brother Yasser. Before we think about, do we have to create a whole new organization, look at the organizations that are already there. And if you see an organization that is doing something like what you believe is the right idea, then commit your time and resources to it and try to get other people in as well. Something that I can't emphasize enough is that the events that such as this one that we've been doing as MPAC UK, it's thanks to volunteers. It's thanks to people who saw us and thought, you know, this is an organization that I can be a part of and is doing something that I believe is right. So join in with organizations that already exist before we start thinking about starting a new one. And Brother Yasser, I'd like to hear your thoughts as well.
I mean, I definitely agree on that. And, you know, we don't need, the world does not need new organizations. It needs the current organizations to properly do their job and fulfill their promises. And they would only fulfill their promises when their members, adherents, supporters, etc., hold the leaders accountable. And there is not a long tradition of holding charities accountable. And that is why every now and then you have a scandal dealing with sexual abuse, money mismanagement, corruption, and working, for example, against Muslims. We saw it again. I mentioned the Grand Mosque of Paris that has worked with the French government to not only push forward the anti-separatism bill, but also to come up with a charter of imams that has even been called out by the Catholic Church in France. Because if it's a secular country, how can the government get involved in what is being done inside mosques? That's none of your business. You can't, on the one hand, call for the protection of laicity and then violate it when it comes to Muslims to keep them under control. So what needs to be done right now is to take a look at the organizations and see which one, of course, you know, makes you feel comfortable, but don't adhere blindly. Never do that. And even for myself as an organizer, I can speak of the CGL that I've been part now for the past 6 years, is that it does not help us as organizers when people follow us blindly. Because then we tend to think everybody agrees, we make decisions, and nobody checks us out telling us, you know, this is wrong. You missed that piece of information. Oh, maybe we can add this to it. Maybe we can twist it or fine-tune the approach, etc. And being held accountable also helps community leaders and heads of NGOs like myself to constantly, how can I say, maintain our level of sincerity, you know, protected. Because it does, again, I mean, like, we are bound to make mistakes. And these mistakes can be avoided when you surround yourself with people who don't shy away from telling you what's what. I'm really proud of, you know, at least for the team that I work with, things really get debated and we can go extensively until we all agree. It does not mean we have to reach consensus. It means that when someone comes up with something, even the founder and president like myself, I know that if I'm far off or wrong, or I forgot something, or I missed something, somebody will remind me, which means that I can also be sure that the people around me support me sincerely because they had their say and they were heard and they made their contribution. The problem with NGOs, and you know what I'm going to say, especially Muslim NGOs, they don't have a tradition of answering their donors. They don't welcome criticism. They don't welcome transparency. And they always, and the people at the head of the organization don't support free and fair elections, and they want to be alone. And I'm going to say here what I said privately that I refrain from saying publicly. Don't worry, Ahmed, there's nothing that will make you liable. If you want monopoly, if you want absolute hegemony, if you want to be alone, while you have the means of acting, you will be alone. Yes, you will crush others, but you will also be crushed alone. Because when the vultures start circling above your head, you're going to seek help. But that help, you destroyed it when you had the political, the financial, and the popular means to do something positive. Where was the resistance when CCIE was crushed? Zero. Let's not lie to ourselves. There was no resistance. There was whining, there was tweeting, there was, this is unfair, France is Islamophobic, how about those, how about those? Yeah, but there was no resistance. There was no mass demonstrations. Where are the thousands of donors? Where was all that money spent? And again, it does not help to seek monopoly. If you seek monopoly, that means you seek power. And if you seek power, I truly question your intentions. And this has to be addressed when you join an organization. Tell me, what is your charter? What are your objectives? How do you answer your donors? When you make a decision, how do you decide? Or is it just like the president or the founder wakes up, does or says something, and everybody has to follow blindly? And that's why we are where we are today. So calling for a new organization won't help, but supporting, and again, I'm not that pessimistic, there are genuinely sincere organizations doing the job. They just lack the means. And not necessarily, sometimes you can overcome financial hardship by having a popular base. You know, you can count on someone for accounting. You can count that person for web design. That person can bring in his network. That person can share. And sometimes you may not bring in $1 million or pounds in donations, but you have maybe 1 million people who are going to take a small share of the work, and that will give you momentum. So that's my call. Join existing organizations and don't be lazy in investigating how an organization works.
Are you okay to take another question?
I'm here for that.
Okay, awesome. So we've talked quite a bit now about the political system. So now I want to take on a few questions which aren't directly about political systems and so on. People ask a lot about boycotts. It's an idea that we've seen work on a huge scale. For example, in South Africa, we've seen it work on a small scale in terms of individual corporations. Recently, we saw Macron. Our perception was that he was internationally humiliated after he insulted Muslims and our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Muslim leaders condemned his behavior and so on. And then he went on some kind of a tour of apology when Muslim leaders banned French products. So from our point of view, it seems like, hey, it can work, but what are your thoughts, like inside France? Does that translate to outcomes? What are your thoughts on general French boycotts? How specific do they need to be? And how effective are they in terms of getting outcomes that are beneficial for the Muslim community?
Well, we cannot minimize the tour organized by the French government with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jean-Yves Le Drian, when he went to different Muslim countries. And we have no problem with Muslims, Islam. Islam is a great religion, etc. We don't care about that. You judge an entity not through its promises, but through its track record, right? So I just want to give a word of caution when it comes to the boycott organized by Muslim majority countries. These boycotts were opportunistic, okay? Because we know that in Muslim countries, the power of the people is not the rule. And to them, they would, of course, bash France when it is, politically, how can I say, profitable. So the boycott, yes, there might be a convergence of interests, but you cannot rely 100% on those governments or regimes. Now, when it comes to boycott, yes, that's something you can do at the immediate level. You can target specific brands and individually not consume them. And French products are exported when it comes to fashion, food, etc. But this boycott cannot be only at the local, at the individual level, but it has to be combined through organized through organizations, which means several organizations come together and they would declare, we are going to boycott specifically those brands that are made in France. Why? For these and that reasons. And especially now with what's happening with the Uyghurs that are facing a genocide in China, how about you boycott both French brands, but more specifically, French brands that outsource their labor in Muslim majority countries like Bangladesh in sweatshops or in concentration camps in China. And these can actually allow you to gain momentum on the question of fighting Islamophobia in France, but also fighting the inhuman conditions, faced by Muslim workers in Bangladesh or other parts, and of course, more importantly, the genocide being faced by the Muslim Uyghur population in China. You can boycott, events organized by France. You can call out again, French media, or, for example, relay calls to boycott. So this is extremely important. But again, it cannot be done only at the individual level. It has to come first with a sincere intention to, I'm going to stop boycotting. And I'm using this platform to send my total support to BDS in favor of Palestine. But now, again, what France is extremely worried about its image abroad. It is so worried about its image that it had to send the Minister of Foreign Affairs abroad, and Emmanuel Macron had to go on Al Jazeera to kind of try to calm things down. And Al Jazeera interviewed me in the minute right after he spoke. I came right after him, and I had to go through a myth-busting rant about what he was saying. That, yes, he says he's got nothing about Islam and Muslims, but he's only cracking down on Islamic and Muslim organizations. He says he's for freedom of speech, but only when it serves his purpose. And he cracks down, for example, on journalists who expose France's sales of weapons to the Saudi regime that's killing millions of Yemenis and starving them to death, that it's working with the most brutal regimes abroad, etc. So denting the image of France will definitely have repercussions. Now, what's done abroad also has to be supported at home. And this is where the responsibility of French civil society comes into play. That it's not sufficient for you guys in the UK or the US or abroad to boycott France. It also has, like in rugby or in American football, you have to get the ball and keep running with it. And this needed to be done by reinforcing existing organizations. And my shout out to go to, for example, to the CRI, the Coordination Against Racism and Islamophobia, based in Lyon. They have been facing repression for years, and they are still there to fight.
So I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Would you be able to take one last question, Brother Yasser?
Sure.
Okay. So just going with the theme of, creating international embarrassment, one question I've got here, would going to European courts or international courts help?
Definitely, because these international platforms, the UN, the OSCE, the European Parliament, the Council of Europe, the European Court of Human Rights, etc., oftentimes are used by Western powers to lecture their political rivals, if not political opponents. So when these platforms are used by countries like France, the US, or the UK, when themselves are violating human rights and civil liberties, I sometimes lose hope when I see civil society not using those same platforms to expose these governments. For example, you have the OSCE. Of course, it does not have a coercive arm on governments, but it does assess human rights and democracy in member states, among which France and the UK. In October 2017, the CJL had set up a coalition of organizations and organizers. Cage was there, Defend the Right to Protect was there, Malia Bouatia was there, the CJL was there, of course, CARE in the US was there as well. And for the first time, we had this transatlantic coordination facing the respective governments. So the CJL went after the French government, Cage went after the UK for the drone strikes, CARE went after the US government, because the OSCE allows you to confront the ambassador of your country. And we kept the call, but few organizations do realize that you cannot leave those platforms that give you echo, that give you leverage, only to your government. If Boris Johnson can go to the UN and start blabbering about how they are in favor of liberty, etc., I would love to see MPACUK or other organizations at the UN right after him to say, by the way, This is what's happening in our country. This is what Bojo is doing to civil society. The same thing to France, and the same thing for the US. People, we are in the age of the internet and memes and people quoting historic figures. People love to quote Malcolm X. When did Malcolm X really become a threat to the establishment? When he said, I'm going to bring the charges of the black population in America against the US at the UN. And he did it. This is where the leverage of courage is humongous. We are in the midst of the Cold War. And Malcolm X takes the matter and makes it an international issue. He goes around Africa to rally around him newly independent countries. And then he says, yes, I will sue the US at the UN for its treatment of the African American population. Unfortunately, JFK was, giving money to these new independent, African countries. They did not follow, but he set the stage and he gave the example. He was willing to work with Che Guevara as well and Fidel Castro, because to him, what's happening in America is not isolated. Racism was an international problem, and you had to deal with it at the international level. As far back, I think, as 1956, he tried to have a local Bandung conference in the heart of Harlem, because to him, what we face, or what they face, was connected to what's happening abroad. So if you are facing limitations at home, go international. You may have a lot more space to operate, a lot more freedom, and you might find, the relays. Maybe you are blacklisted in the UK in the media, but maybe French media would welcome you because they want to bash the UK. By the way, there is some big beef going between France and the UK. You could contact French media and tell them all the bad you think and of the Bojo administration. And this is where you combine your efforts at the local level with international efforts. Failing to do that is really like, condemning yourself to being isolated and giving more freedom for your government to really strangle you and make it impossible to organize, let alone question the status quo.
I think that is a very eloquently put, and also a very convenient place to end it there. We started the Q&A talking about how politics on a local level is affected by mosques, and how it's a bit simpler on a local level to try to get victories there. And now we've ended the Q&A with internationalizing the struggle for justice, inshallah. So I think we've covered everything from local to international scale. So I look forward to continuing this conversation with you. We have a raft of events coming up as MPACUK. I really encourage all viewers to share this video from our Facebook page. We will be producing this video with French subtitles in the coming weeks, inshallah. Follow us on social media, sign up to our mail shop, sign up and become a volunteer, so then we can continue doing events like these in partnership with fantastic international speakers like Brother Yasser here. I will end the live stream here.